Good afternoon. Wonderful. My name is Lori White, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this community gathering to reflect upon the important values of unity, justice, and peace. This year, we have once again chosen freedom of expression as our theme, as an opportunity for our community to reflect upon two values we hold as equally important: freedom of expression and inclusion. Freedom of expression, the value that universities should be about the free expression of ideas, to ponder, discuss, challenge, and offer a variety of perspectives towards seeking, in the words of our university motto, strength through truth. Inclusion, the value that our Washington University community is one that affirms the human dignity of each member of our community and our many identities and experiences, and also acknowledges that disproportionate impact that some speech has on members of our community that have been historically marginalized. Each year we select a text for the Common Reading program for the first-year class. How many here are members of the first-year class? I hope your first day has gone fabulously. This year's book, as you know, members of the first-year class, is by Nadine Strossen, titled Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I'm so delighted that Professor Strossen is able to serve as our speaker for tonight's reflection program. You'll have the opportunity to hear from Professor Strossen shortly. Showing on the screen as we began to gather for today's program were reflections on the book from members of our first-year class. So for the members of the first-year class who are here, those of us who served as discussion leaders, including myself, for the Common Reading, appreciate your thoughtful engagement with the text. And those of you who have not yet had the chance to read the book, you will be able to receive a copy at the reception following the program. During today's program, we look forward to hearing from Professor Strossen, from all of you, regarding her perspectives on freedom of expression. And as we gather today, let us think about how we can hold the values of freedom of expression and inclusion while being committed to mutual respect, tolerance, civility, and caring for one another, even when we have differences of opinion or perspective. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Andrew D. Martin, our 15th Chancellor. Andrew Martin was appointed Chancellor of Washington University on July 14, 2018. No stranger to Washington University, Chancellor Martin received his PhD in political science from WashU in 1998 and served on the Washington University faculty for 14 years. Chancellor Martin also served as the Vice Dean of the Washington University School of Law. Prior to becoming Chancellor at WashU, Andrew Martin served as the Dean of the College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts at the University of Michigan. Since starting officially as Chancellor earlier this year, Andrew has hit the ground running and has brought wonderful energy to WashU. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Martin and Nadine Strossen to the stage.
Good afternoon, and thanks for being with us as we hear from renowned advocate, author, and Professor Nadine Strossen, and continue our shared reflection about her book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. As you know, this year we've asked you to read Professor Strossen's book, which has served as an outstanding primer for our ongoing discussions here at Washington University about what it means to engage in respectful dialogues across our differences, what it means to be an institution of higher education whose very mission is to disseminate knowledge and cultivate the free and at times complicated exploration of truth, and what it means for us to be a university community, especially at this time in our current cultural and political context. Last week, I had the chance to facilitate a student discussion about the book, and together we engaged in thought-provoking conversation about the history and current status of our First Amendment rights. From social protest to our administrative leaders' uses of speech and ongoing debates about various topics, from diversity to immigration to reproductive rights, it seems like we're at a crucial moment where our dialogues around freedom of speech and what we constitute as hate speech have come to a true point of friction. And that is why Nadine Strossen's book is so important. As we use our history of legal precedent as well as our contemporary context to inform our understanding of these issues, issues that are sensitive yet integral to our identity as humans and as citizens. Here at Washington University, we see these as highly complex issues. We also see them as highly important, in fact, central to our mission, as we help prepare you to become compassionate, values-oriented leaders who will leave this place with the tools necessary to thrive and flourish in the midst of a rapidly changing global society. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest. Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. She is a leading expert in constitutional law and human rights. She is immediate past president of the American Civil Liberties Union, serving from 1991 to 2008 in that role, and now serves on the advisory boards of the ACLU, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and Heterodox Academy. When Nadine stepped down as ACLU president, 3 ideologically diverse Supreme Court justices participated in her farewell tribute luncheon: Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and David Souter. The National Law Journal has named Strossen one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and several other publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. Her many honorary degrees and awards include the American Bar Association's prestigious Margaret Brent Women Lawyers of Achievement Award in 2017. Strossen has made thousands of public presentations before diverse audiences around the world, including on more than 500 university campuses. A frequent media commentator, she has published widely in both academic and general interest publications. Her 2018 book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, has earned praise from ideologically diverse experts, including progressive Harvard University professor Cornel West and conservative Princeton University professor Robert George, both of whom were on this campus engaging in reasoned debate earlier this calendar year. The academic year started today. Nadine's presence here with us today is also special for me personally, as I remember hearing her speak when I was an undergraduate student at the College of William and Mary in the early 1990s. To that end, I was in your similar shoes, a student ready to engage in dialogues about complex issues and eager to make my own unique mark on the world. Nadine was an inspiration to me when I was an undergraduate. She continues to be one for me now, and I hope she'll be the same for all of you. Nadine, thank you again for being with us here at Washington University. We're incredibly honored that you're here and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Please join me in welcoming Nadine Strossen to Washington University.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and the wonderful introduction. I had been promised that I would be the beneficiary of radical hospitality here, and that certainly is true. And I'm so happy to be part of Andrew Martin's new chancellorship. What an impressive Renaissance person he is, and all of you are in for a great treat under his wonderful leadership. Andrew told us, and we agreed we could be on a first-name basis with each other. Don't mean to be disrespectful, just cordial. Andrew told you the story that long ago, when he was an undergraduate, I was already evangelizing on campus, and I thought it would really be terrific to carry on that pattern. So I want to promise that at least one of the students here in the audience today, let's say about 20 to 25 years years in the future, you don't have to be a chancellor. You could be a faculty member or a dean or a department chair. Please bring me to your campus. I promise I will do everything I can to be alive and kicking. I think there's no danger that we're going to run out of issues to be crusading on. I don't think we will have achieved liberty and justice for all by then, but if not, I like to invoke one of my civil rights and human rights heroes, the poet and activist Alice Walker, African-American woman who said, "Activism is the rent I pay for living on this planet." And that's exactly the way I feel about it. Speaking of Alice Walker, I do want to say it was very kind of you to begin your academic year, hold your convocation, invite me on Women's Equality Day. Almost 100 years since women finally earned the right to vote, and we still have our issues cut out for us. I want to also say how deeply honored I am to be back here at Washington University, where I've had the pleasure of speaking quite a few times in the past. I really have, through my own personal experience, as well as having many connections, friends and relatives who have gone to school here, a dear friend who was on the faculty here. So I have the deepest respect for you as a community and as an educational environment in particular. This summer, there was a column in the Wall Street Journal that was lambasting other universities for choices of common reading books that this particular writer did not appreciate. But the bottom line was, at the end of the column, he praised Washington University for having chosen my book. I couldn't shy away from that compliment, but he paid, I thought, a backhanded compliment to your fine university when he referred to WashU as the Harvard of the lower central Midwest. And I thought, no, Harvard is the Washington University of the lower central Northeast. And I do have to say that I am disappointed in my alma mater. Harvard has not been as great on free speech as I believe that Washington University has been really terrific on all of the issues that are at stake. Not only freedom of speech, but equally important, equality, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony, and individual well-being. I've read about episodes on your campus. Of course, we all still face challenges, and those challenges are heartbreaking, but the responses that I've seen from this community are so constructive and so proactive. So I'm really happy to be here, to be part of that. I also, in reading about one of the sad incidents of racist expression that unfortunately permeates all of our society, I was very struck by this article. This was from an episode last fall, and I'm reading from an article that was in Huffington Post, and it quotes undergraduate research assistant Han Yu Seo, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who shared a screenshot of several freshman students complaining about their Asian American peers who were using a study room. And forgive me, it's quoting some negative stereotypes, but that was the sad reality. The article quotes the concept of Asian Americans, quote, taking over as evoking an image of a foreign threat, very similar to what's often said about my tribe, namely Jews. And this article quotes Julie Park, an associate professor at the University of Maryland College Park, said, at the same time, Asian Americans are also stereotyped as being more passive, which leads to the assumption that people can make these types of comments without Asian Americans pushing back, unfortunately. So the article then goes on to quote the student here, Ms. Xiao, as saying, "We have been taught all our lives to stay silent. Well, now it is our turn to speak." And I thought that was, that's always the silver lining to the cloud, or one hopes that there is that silver lining to the cloud of hateful speech, that it will galvanize counter speech and counteraction, including inspiring and emboldening people who have been silent in the past, and not at all to suggest that it's those who are disparaged who bear the burden of answering back. That is a burden and a responsibility, and indeed, I would say, an opportunity for all of us. Whenever there is hateful, disparaging, stereotyping, discriminatory expression, it behooves all of us to raise our voices in the most constructive way that we can. And I've been so inspired in my journey evangelizing about these issues to really see examples such as the one that I cited from this article, where more and more students, including those who have traditionally been silenced or marginalized, raising their voices. I happened to read an article in the New York Times yesterday about, it was celebrating incoming students at colleges all over the United States who have come from particularly challenging background, namely students from the poorest, most chaotic country in the world, Zimbabwe, or at least the poorest country with a chaotic educational system. And I was struck that one of the students who was featured is a first-year student at Columbia University. I live right around the corner from Columbia University, where my husband is on the faculty. Her name is Wadzane Maisene. She goes by Wadzi for short. She was raised by a single mother who did not have a steady job from the time that Wadzi was 9 years old on, as if all of that immense poverty and educational deprivation was not hardship enough. When she was 12 years old, she developed bone cancer and had to have most of her left leg amputated. With all of these hardships, she somehow managed to secure the education and the opportunity to come to the United States. For the very first time, she had never been out of her country, come to Columbia University, where she is planning to pursue studies in medicine to become a pediatric oncologist, go back to Zimbabwe and help the future students such as herself. So the columnist who interviewed her was saying, wasn't this emotionally traumatizing and psychologically distressing for you, all of these hardships? And she said, and this was not rehearsed, right? It's a spontaneous interview, but I wrote it down word for word. She said, "You're not defined by the things that hold you back. You're defined by how you rise above them." So the two students that I've quoted, one from your campus, one from the home campus of my husband, to me are completely typical of the hundreds and hundreds of diverse students I've had the pleasure of interacting with over the past couple of years as I've been talking about these issues. And I feel it's so important to celebrate all of you, because unfortunately there is too much bad-mouthing going on in too much of the media. And I have to say, for all of the impressive students that I have encountered all over this country and beyond, none are more impressive than the Washington University students whose questions and essays and comments and projects I've been delighted to pour through. It is absolutely inspiring, and I can't wait to have as much engagement with you as possible. Speaking of which, I promised that these opening remarks would be brief. I suspect they're already not brief because I'm so enthusiastic about the subject, but even more enthusiastic about hearing you. So I was asked just to say a few words about why I wrote the book. And I have to say I am so happy to answer that question here because the whole project literally began right here in St. Louis almost exactly 5 years ago. And it's another example of a terrible cloud. That's an understatement. The unjustified killing of Michael Brown and in Ferguson leading to protests and an unearthing of the patterns of injustice that characterized not only that place, but it's shorthand for everywhere all over this country and beyond where we see similar injustices. Now, the ACLU and I personally had been crusading against racial injustice, especially in the criminal justice system, for decades and not getting any traction. This goes back to the 1980s when a young ACLU staff lawyer in California coined the term, a chilling term but sadly accurate, driving while black. Some of you may recognize her name now. It is Michelle Alexander. Of course, she went on to great fame and acclaim, writing an entire book about this enormous problem, the new Jim Crow. But literally, straight out of law school, she coined this term, and the ACLU began a campaign that had no support even within the Democratic Party, because this was the time when Clinton was moving the party to the so-called center and becoming tough on crime, and that's becoming an election issue now. But anyway, it was so affirming to suddenly see in the wake of these horrible tragedies, including the Michael Brown killing and others around the country, that finally this is an issue that is making people concerned, giving new energy to the Black Lives Matter movement, which had been formed several years before, but really was only galvanized and became a recognized nationwide force after that. And in particular to me, since I'm so committed to freedom and opportunity and equality for young people, to see the campus activism that began right here in this state and spread around the country after decades during which college students were relatively apathetic, that every survey showed that students on the whole weren't even interested in learning about political issues following the news, let alone becoming engaged. And I'm so sorry that it's tragedies and injustice and oppression that motivate people to become engaged. But as an activist, I always have to look at the glass half full, and the glass half full is engagement, which is continuing. I was, however, extremely disturbed at the extent to which there were more and more anecdotal and survey reports that people who were crusading for all of the causes that are so dear to my heart throughout my life, equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity, that too many people seem to believe that robust freedom of speech was antithetical to these causes, contrary to what my experience and my knowledge and study had always shown, that it's exactly the opposite, that without robust freedom of speech that's sufficiently robust even to extend to ideas that other people see as hateful and hated, we will never have a sufficiently effective movement for equality and for all of these other causes. So it became clear to me that that message had not been effectively communicated, advocated in the past, and I took it upon myself to investigate and educate and advocate, but I was also investigating and educating for myself. I do strive to be open-minded, and I had at the forefront of my mind a question That is the title of a forthcoming book by a friend of mine who is the president of Skidmore College, a philosophy professor. He gave me permission to quote the title of the book. He says it will give him an impetus to actually write the book when he steps down from his presidency. But I think it's such a great title. And the title is a question. What would it take to change your mind? What would it take to change your mind? And if we're not talking about an article of religious faith, right, there has to be an answer to that question. And I honestly believe, to the extent that one can be open-minded, that if I had seen evidence that censoring more hateful speech than may permissibly be censored under our current legal system, if I had seen evidence that that would be an effective way to advance the equally compelling goals of equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity, I would have been all in favor of it. And by the way, so would the First Amendment, because the First Amendment does not absolutely ban any restrictions on speech. It simply puts an appropriately heavy burden on government to justify any restriction. We lawyers call it strict scrutiny. And what that translates into is if the government can demonstrate that the restriction is necessary in order to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance, which equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity certainly are, then the restriction is justified. So I approached about 20 years of evidence that had amassed since I had last studied this issue. We have countries all over the world that have censored hateful speech, and we have some experiences in the United States as well before hate speech laws get struck down. And I was persuaded, as I had been in the past, that no matter how well intended these laws are, they are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. And that's the bad news. The good news is that I became more encouraged than ever about how constructive and productive and effective counter-speech and other non-censorial strategies can be. I also want to tell you just something personal. I am so impassioned about all of these issues, not only through my work, lifelong work as a human rights activist, but personally. I mentioned in the book that my father is a Holocaust survivor, but I didn't really go into the details. I'm so proud of the fact that when he was a teenager, he was born in Berlin as what, under the vicious, racist, so-called Nuremberg laws, he was classified as a Jew of the second degree, which meant that one of his parents was Jewish. He already got in trouble as a teenager because of his anti-Hitler political activism, and as a teenager, he was thrown into the forced labor camp at Buchenwald. Now, when he went in, he was young enough and healthy enough and strong enough that they did not immediately slate him for slaughter, but he was forced to do brutal, back-breaking, soul-crushing slave labor in a situation that was absolutely deplorable: malnutrition, disease rampant, people dying like flies. He almost died of pleurisy. And the bottom line is that as an undesirable, double undesirable, because he was a political dissident as well as a half Jew, he was scheduled to be sterilized. You know about the so-called eugenics program that the Nazis had. And literally 1 day before he was going to be sterilized, he was liberated by the American military as they liberated the Buchenwald camp. But I still get chills when I say that, so I really literally owe my life as well as my liberty to the American military. On my maternal side, my grandfather, who was an immigrant to this country before World War I, was a protester against the war. He was a Marxist and really opposed capitalism, opposed the war effort, was a pacifist. That was a crime. You know, the ACLU was just getting founded at this time. My grandfather could have been one of our clients, but people were literally being imprisoned for peacefully expressing opposition to the war. My grandfather's sentence in Hudson County, New Jersey, was to be forced to stand outside the courthouse, spread-eagled, with his hands and his feet spread against the courthouse wall so that passersby could spit on him. And so I have a tradition in my family of seeing violations of the most profound violations of freedom of conscience as well as equality, and not surprising that I'm passionately committed to both of them and continue to believe that on the whole they're mutually reinforcing. Since I wrote the book, I had to turn the manuscript about 2 years ago. Publication is a slow process, and I've continued to look at the evidence with an open mind, and I can report that in the last 2 years, we continue to see mounting evidence of the ineffectiveness of censoring hate speech on the bad side, but the growing evidence about effective strategies for counter speech on the good side. I've been focusing most intensely recently, including congressional testimony this summer, on social media, since that has become the dominant forum for either free speech or censorship, as the case might be. And I have a lot of examples. My book is coming out with a new epilogue, which focuses completely on social media, but my time is up now, so I'm just going to read to you, because I really do want to hear from you, but I'm going to read to you the opening quote that I'm using in the epilogue for the paperback of the book. And this relates to an extremely recent situation. Namely that horrible week, very recently, when we had 3 mass murders, and then there was a pattern of one of those in El Paso and a couple others being accompanied with racist tirades online. And that pressured one of the online companies, namely Cloudflare, to banish 8chan, which was a channel that was carrying these racist screeds. And here's what the CEO of Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, said about that just a couple of weeks ago. He said, "Almost exactly 2 years ago, we made the determination to kick another disgusting site off Cloudflare's network, the Daily Stormer, but they quickly came back online using a Cloudflare competitor. They have bragged that they have more readers than ever. I have little doubt we'll see the same thing happen with 8chan. Removing 8chan from our network does nothing to address why hateful sites fester online. It does nothing to address why mass shootings occur. It does nothing to address why portions of the population feel so disenchanted they turn to hate." So we need to do the harder work of addressing those underlying causes, and I could not be more thrilled that all of you are going to continue to do that hard work, but it's also a joyous opportunity as well, by exercising your most precious right, and you all know that is the right not to remain silent. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much again for being here, and thank you for your opening remarks. We're going to engage in a bit of a conversation, and then in a little while we'll open the floor to some of our first-year students who submitted questions, and then we'll open up the floor to broader questions thereafter. I want to start by asking a question about how we got to this place. As I sort of look at the world today, I think I'm seeing 3 things that are happening simultaneously that we tend to be doing collectively. We tend to be using speech as a weapon to divide people more than to unite people. We jump or even leap to really rash accusations of hate speech. And there are also many members of our community with a strong desire to censor said speech and consequently reduce our rights to freedom of expression. So if you look back over the arc of history over the last 5 or 10 or 25 or 50 years, how do you think we got to this point?
First of all, I have to say that as I look at the arc of history being older, I see that there have been similar problems forever in the sense that it is intuitively appealing to want to silence ideas that we dislike and that we think are potentially dangerous. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a great Supreme Court justice who initially in dissents at the beginning of the 20th century started articulating a strong concept of free speech, talked about how it just made sense. He understood that if you hated an idea, of course you would want to censor it. And so you have to kind of do a back step to understand why that actually is not so sensible in the long run. I would say about 25 years ago, maybe even longer, a journalist named Nat Hentoff wrote a book whose title says it all. It was called Freedom of Speech for Me, but not for thee, how the right and left relentlessly censor each other. So I think there is no doubt that we do have very serious problems now. I don't think they are unprecedented. I think what is perhaps different about it, Andrew, is that we have a decline in what's called civil discourse, of people engaging with those they disagree with at the highest levels of government. So you regularly hear members of Congress who have been there for a while say that they used to be able to have collaborative relationships with people on the other side of the aisle, but that is becoming more and more rare.
So when you think about the mass political culture, so step away from DC and think about regular folks in society. Of course, some, I don't know exactly where on that continuum, of the discourse that we tend to have, particularly about politics, is mediated through social network platforms. To what extent do you think social media has amplified some of these issues regarding speech that we've seen recently?
It is a medium of communication, which means that it just transmits and distributes whatever we, the speakers, choose to put there. And I think that, as with all media, it is a potential vehicle for a lot of positive expression, as well as a potential vehicle for a lot of negative expression. And it's interesting that the public and media and political assessment of the social media has veered back and forth so dramatically. I think when the internet in general and social media in particular were new, there was what in another context has been called irrational exuberance, only looking at the positive and celebrating that and underestimating the potential negative. And now the pendulum has swung, I think, too much the other way. But let us, today on Women's Equality Day, let us not forget that the Me Too movement could not have gotten off the ground were it not for social media. Black Lives Matter really didn't flourish until it was for social media. And there still are and all of the candidates that in the past would not have been able to raise the money and develop the momentum to run as young people, as women, as people of color that we've seen in absolutely unprecedented numbers, including at the national level. All of that has been facilitated by social media. Obviously, there is a dark side as well. And what I find really encouraging, Andrew, is the extent to which social scientists, people with your expertise among others, are investigating the most constructive ways to harness the unique power of social media to rebut hate and to recruit people away from hateful groups and to support those who are disparaged.
So last week during my discussion section, we spent a lot of time talking about the nature of First Amendment protection, and that there's a line between speech that causes harm and speech having a tendency to harm. How do you see that distinction? And can you provide us some sort of common sense ways to sort those two different types of speech into separate buckets?
Yes. So these are terms that actually come from the United States Supreme Court, although I do have to interject that one area that I didn't discuss in the book that's going to be a big feature in the epilogue, because I don't think it's nearly as well known as it should be, is to what extent U.S. First Amendment law really significantly overlaps with international human rights free speech law under Article 19, the free speech guarantee in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that's something I think, we hear about American exceptionalism, and if we're exceptional in positive ways, that doesn't embarrass me. But I think it's really important to understand that jurists internationally have arrived at the same conclusions, namely that if we allow government latitude to punish speech because it has, and this is the term the Supreme Court used to use, a bad tendency or a harmful tendency, that simply gives the government too much latitude to effectively pick and choose whichever ideas it dislikes. Again, Oliver Wendell Holmes said it very well when he said, every idea is an incitement, right? So if we allow government to suppress every idea that might have a bad tendency or might incite somebody to engage in a bad act, that's carte blanche for the government to say, well, I don't like that idea and I don't like that idea, and that's what happened. So the Supreme Court tightened it up, starting in dissenting opinions in the early 20th century, and by 1969, a unanimous decision in an ACLU case, I'm happy to say, the Supreme Court adopted what's often called the emergency test, and this is also adopted in international law, that government may only censor speech when it's necessary to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. That still gives, and so there are specific examples, if the speech directly causes certain specific, serious, imminent harm, such as intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently, or a true threat where the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear that you're going to be subject to violence or targeted harassment. There is some degree of discretion, no doubt about it. That's why even when the Supreme Court unanimously applies those standards, sometimes there's not a unanimous agreement on how they apply in a particular situation, but it really reduces the discretion a great deal. And in particular, it makes it much harder for the court under the pretext of preventing some harm, such as violence, let's say, or even a threat of violence. That's a pretext for stifling an idea that is unpopular or feared.
So Nadine, you and I both have the good fortune of getting to spend a great deal of our time on college campuses. And of course, college campuses play, I think, a very important role as places where ideas can be bounced around and people can engage in conversation with the idea of ultimately getting to the truth. At the same time, if you look at many college campuses today, there are many students and members of our community who would push back on the major thesis of your book, and would make arguments about the necessity of us censoring certain types of speech, particularly perhaps at a private university, which doesn't have a legal obligation to follow the First Amendment, although we could debate whether or not there's a moral obligation to do so. Given your conversations on college campuses over the last couple of years, What arguments have you found most persuasive, and how would you respond to them?
I think the most persuasive argument I've heard about the harmful impact of hateful speech, and let me put a parenthesis here because throughout my book I talk about the potential harmful impact, because I have believed that all of us can develop habits of mind and resilience, such as the young woman that I quoted in my book. That I quoted in my remarks, and in my book I quote social psychologists and mental health experts who say all of us can learn, including through cognitive behavior techniques, to not allow words to have the power to do harm to us. So the most persuasive argument I've heard against that, and right now it's a hypothesis because I've seen counter evidence, is that some neuroscientific evidence suggests that there may well be an immediate impact that we can't even discern, that it's subconscious, and that it has an adverse impact not only psychologically and emotionally, but also physiologically. Still, that would not rebut my conclusion that censoring hate speech is not necessarily the best response, because that's only part of the analysis. And I'm not I am result-oriented. The result I want to reach is maximum equality and freedom and dignity for everybody, no matter who you are and no matter what you believe. So if I were persuaded that there is this immediate impact, I would then want to investigate what is the most effective way to prevent that impact or to remediate it. And again, censoring might not do so much good because people are still going to be exposed to those ideas, and maybe what we have to do is just prepare them for the best possible counter strategy.
One of the things that we've asked our first-year students to do, and the window's still open for the competition, you've got until the end of the week, is to come up with an example of counter speech for some idea or some thought that our students find repugnant.
Have those been shared with the community? Because the ones I read were just phenomenal.
There will be when they're done.
Okay.
We had to give the...
I don't mean to discourage other people from entering the competition.
Yeah, but the bar is high. Given your experience, and in this particular environment where we sit today, what do you find is the most productive or persuasive ways to engage in counter speech, particularly for undergraduate students?
It is infinitely varied, and you have to make a strategic judgment in any particular situation. What are your goals in that situation, and what are the most effective ways to achieve it? For example, I would say this: one thing that has been done very effectively on this campus when there was a sad, tragic racist incident that I read about from last fall. I mean, the university immediately has to speak up to condemn the discrimination and to support the people who have been the victims of the discrimination, to call to task the law enforcement officials in this case who were responsible for the discrimination, and make it absolutely clear that that is completely inconsistent with the values of this community. And that's not just lip service. Again, I've been really happy to read studies that say that that kind of support, just as the hate speech itself can immediately do a lot of harm. So that kind of support and rebuttal against it also can immediately have an enormously positive impact. Suppose your goal, though, is to, there's some group, a racist speaker or racist organization that's going to be speaking on campus. It's too late to dissuade whoever invited them to come to retract the invitation. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, which are two of the expert organizations whose work I really admire and how do we counter these messages, they say, you know, it may feel morally satisfying to engage in a very vigorous, even some would say violent altercation with those hate mongers, that it's really just going to be playing into their game plan, which is precisely to attract the attention, including from the media, and then inevitably additional sympathy and support by having that kind of vociferous pushback. And so they say sometimes the most effective form of counterspeech, if you want to mute the message, you may be unintentionally doing exactly the opposite, amplifying the message by having that kind of in-your-face confrontational counter-protest. Again, you have to make the decision on a case-by-case basis, but they strongly urge just, you know, try to ignore them. Then they won't get the airplay that they're seeking, and have an affirmative event of your own somewhere else that can draw attention celebrating diversity and equality and inclusivity. One other example I want to give, Andrew, because I've spent my life dealing with ideas, and I think of, you know, a natural form of counter speech is debates. In fact, I've done a debate right here on this stage quite a few years ago. But we've all read evidence that people who have ideas that we think are completely erroneous and positions that we think are immoral, that you give them more information, you give them analysis, is not necessarily going to change their perspective. That's the bad news. But the good news is that they don't necessarily have those perspectives as a matter of ideology. I've been reading a lot about what causes hate and what causes people to be drawn to hate groups. And it often has nothing to do with ideas. It has to do with psychological problems, sociological problems. They have family issues. They have school issues. They don't have any relationships. And so they become ripe for recruitment, not because of the ideas, but as the bonding experience, and the ideas come later. So not surprisingly, if you want to redeem them, and this is actually the term that's used by the noble souls, many of whom are religious, as the language would suggest, but certainly not all, you have to provide an alternative bonding experience. And you don't do that by treating these people as criminals. You don't do it by treating them as pariahs. You have to engage with them in a compassionate way and an empathetic way. And there are very, very moving accounts that are documented online, podcasts, TED Talks, books, of people who have very patiently engaged in building those bonds, and that creates an opportunity for the hate monger himself or herself to rethink his or her own ideas. It's not done in a didactic fashion. There's an entire organization, probably more than one, but the one that I know the most about is called Life After Hate, based in Chicago, that consists entirely of people, including former leaders of vicious, violent, hateful organizations that have been redeemed. They call themselves formers, and now they are engaging with training and mediation to help others leave that fold.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I could ask questions for hours, but I am going to turn things over to our students who have had an opportunity not only to read your book, but to gather in community with one another, with many of my faculty colleagues, to talk about the book and what the implications are for us at Washington University. We've selected 3 of our students who are going to ask initial questions, and then we will open up the microphone to anyone else who would like to line up and ask Nadine some questions. Our first question will come from Chloe Altschul, who was from my discussion section last week. Oh. So Chloe, please.
Thank you so much for taking my question. I appreciated the more speech, not less theme highlighted in the book, since a healthy democracy requires diverse viewpoints and respectful debate. In light of the tribalism and hyperpolarization on college campuses today, how do you suggest we better foster open dialogue and intellectual diversity?
It's a great question, Chloe, and one of the reasons why I am such a fan of affirmative action in higher education is precisely to have the opportunity to bring people together from all kinds of different backgrounds. And now we're talking also about ideological differences as well as identity differences. But social scientists, I guess the field is sociology and social psychology, for many years have documented a phenomenon called the contact theory. And like a lot of social science, this is not an insult, it's a compliment. Like a lot of social science, it seems commonsensical, but it's very nice to have the data, because common sense is sometimes wrong, as I know. But study after study, going back to the 1940s, shows that the best way to get people to overcome their negative stereotypes and prejudices is to actually interact with the people that they have those negative stereotypes about. And that's one of the distressing things. If Democrats aren't speaking to Republicans or even having meals with them, they're just going to keep festering in their negative stereotypes about each other. Now, hopefully, it would happen organically on a campus where you have diverse students. But in addition to that, many campuses, and for that matter, larger communities, are facilitating discussions among people with different views. And one group on campus is called Bridge. There are others that have the word constructive dialogue in it. And basically they have trained facilitators who further discussion in a skilled way with people who strongly disagree on particular subjects. And I have read really positive accounts about it. I've actually witnessed a couple of these experiences. And let me just give you one example from my own experience. And it wasn't something that was a facilitated dialogue, but it really illustrates how this can happen. I had a really special opportunity to attend a breakfast meeting with former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. Shortly after he stepped down from the Supreme Court, I was speaking at a conference about his jurisprudence and invited to the breakfast where I would say maybe 10 to 15 people who were speaking at that conference. And we just engaged in a very casual conversation with him. He was very personable. We asked him challenging questions. He gave his answers, but the answers reflected his thoughtfulness and his values and his personal experiences. And right at the end, a gentleman said, you know, I came here, he said, I have to tell you, I am a Muslim Arab American. I feel it necessary to identify myself that way in this country now, unfortunately. He said, I came here prepared to hate you. He was, because Kennedy cast the deciding vote upholding Trump's so-called Muslim travel ban. And he said, I think it was the wrong decision. I completely disagree with you, but I can't hate you. I understand why you arrived at that result. And I think that's, is somebody, maybe some of you there might think, well, he should be hated for having, and we can debate that, but I think as human beings, if we are to find some common ground at some level, you know, we're not going to get Kennedy to go as closely as we would like. I say we, the ACLU, is leading the charge against the travel ban. But there's no hope of moving closer to your position unless you're willing to accept and engage on a human level, not a hateful level.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is from Eli Nirenberg.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is, the Supreme Court clarified in the cases District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago that the right to bear arms is an individual right. Many states also have laws permitting the open carry of guns, including here in Missouri. Often, individuals can find the presence of guns or other weapons at a political or cultural rally to be imposing or even dangerous. How does the regulation of speech change, if at all, when demonstrators legally bear arms while engaging in hate speech?
Thank you so much, Eli. And I had the privilege of speaking at the law school earlier today, and I found out that there's going to be a symposium or some kind of program at the law school fairly soon that deals precisely with the issue of what is the impact of Second Amendment rights on First Amendment rights. So you would obviously be very interested in finding out about that. And your question is exactly on target, no pun intended. One of the examples of speech that does satisfy the emergency test is a true threat. When the speaker means to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the person or group at whom the expression is directed, that person is going to be subject to an attack, that is a punishable threat, even if the speaker does not intend to actually carry out a violent act. Because if you reasonably feel fear that you're going to be subject to attack, that's already harming you, right? It's harming your freedom of movement, it's harming your freedom of speech. So I think of the Charlottesville situation when I hear your question. Repugnant as the message of the demonstrators was there. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Horrible. But repugnant as it is, that is not a justification for suppressing the speech. But you put it in the context where they are making those statements armed with torches that are lighted, armed with firearms that are loaded. I personally think that that does rise to the level of a true threat that would be punishable. And for that reason, the ACLU, which had defended the free speech rights of the demonstrators in Charlottesville, re-examined our position to stress that one of the factors that we would take into account even more attentively in the future than we had in the past was the extent to which speech becomes unprotected because of the presence of firearms.
Thank you. So can I ask a bit of a follow-up?
Sure, go ahead.
He's the boss.
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying with the ACLU's position. Do you think that the Supreme Court, given their pro-individual gun rights stance, would see the nexus of gun rights and free speech rights as problematic?
This is an excellent question, and it has a different answer today than it would have had a year or two ago because of the change in the Supreme Court. When Justice Scalia, for a 5-4 majority, wrote the opinion in Heller, and then it was perpetuated in McDonald, as you recognize, he very carefully did not even extend the scope of the Second Amendment right to the situation that you're describing, Eli. He very strongly stressed that the only issue the court was addressing in that case was the right of individuals in their homes to possess firearms for the purpose of defending their homes. And he expressly left open that the court was not even answering the question of when you get beyond the home context, whether there is even a Second Amendment right in the first place, let alone whether it could then be checked by a countervailing First Amendment right. And he took pains to give examples of regulations that would be permitted, and one of the examples he gave was in certain sensitive public places. So I would have said if the composition of the court had been the same now as it is then, the court would not extend Second Amendment rights to the kinds of situations that we're talking about. But there has been a significant personnel change, and since you're interested in these issues, you probably know, but I'll tell everybody else that for the first time since then, the court has accepted a Second Amendment case, and that strikes joy in the heart of those who have a robust view of the Second Amendment, because they believe that this newly constituted conservative majority of the court is likely to expand the scope of Second Amendment rights.
Thank you.
So our final question is from, before we open up the microphone to anyone else who would like to pose a question, final question is from Lexi Hansen.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica to a poor family and left at Maxfield Park Orphanage when I was a few days old. I live in the U.S. now, but have returned to Jamaica many times and learned that their motto is, out of many, one people. Jamaicans are a mix of descendants of African slaves, Chinese, Spanish, and Europeans. There is not racial or religious discrimination. If someone is poor, what they say has less influence, and if one is rich, they are heard more, and what they say has more influence. In Ferguson, did they have to burn buildings to get people to listen? There is obvious discrimination based on economic status. What is your take on this issue, and what could be done to give the poor a stronger voice to be heard?
Thank you so much, Lexi. And I was so struck, I got to read these questions in advance to do you the respect of thinking about them in advance. I was very struck by every aspect of your question, starting with the first, what the motto is, because that used to be the national motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of one, many. And then for political reasons, it was changed to in God we trust. And I personally think that E pluribus unum is a much more inclusive, embracing motto for all the reasons that you stress, that does describe the best that this country has been and hopefully will return to. Speaking of which, the symbol of all of that, the Statue of Liberty, does proclaim that we are welcoming the poor, as well as others who have been dispossessed, disenfranchised, marginalized in other societies. Sadly, as you know, I'm sure, racial minorities overlap with poverty to a distressing degree in this country. And so it's no coincidence that Martin Luther King, toward the end of his life, was fighting for poor people as part of his broad human rights and racial justice agenda. Again, the protests that we've seen increasing in this country, not only on college campuses, but also taking over at least the Democratic Party. And I don't mean this as a partisan comment, but I think that the Democrats who are vying for the nomination, many of them are making income inequality and wealth inequality much more of a serious issue. So the Constitution did not originally have any equality guarantee at all, which is shocking, but we understand what the reason for that is. Since the Civil War, there has been a very important equality guarantee, and it has allowed us to make some progress, enough that we should be encouraged to continue the fight. And I can tell that you're raring to go. So that's how you're going to use the opportunity of an education here to work on those issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If anyone else would like to ask a question, we have time for at least 2 or 3, I believe.
Hi.
Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Sayed. I'm a junior here at Washington University studying International Area Studies and Anthropology. And first I'd like to say I am an Arab American and a Muslim American woman living on this campus. And with that identity, it is, to say the least, difficult to live on a campus with an overwhelmingly Jewish population that overtly and unapologetically supports the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I also have taken courses about the Middle East, about my culture about Middle Eastern politics that has been taught by an Israeli professor. And with all of these very conflicting feelings that I have, and I know many of my fellow Arab and Muslim classmates have, what advice do you have for us when we feel unsafe on this campus, when we feel we don't really have a platform, and when we try to express ourselves with our freedom of speech, that we are silenced, ignored, etc.? What advice do you have for us as a minority on this campus?
I'm so sorry to hear that you feel that you're silenced and ignored. And what's so interesting and distressing is I've heard that complaint on many other campuses, but I've also heard a complaint from Jewish students on many campuses exactly what you're saying, that they feel ignored, that they feel uncomfortable, that they feel unsafe. And in fact, there are indications that the whole conflict in the Middle East is one of the most explosive, divisive issues on campus. So this is an example where it would be really important to try to bring together people with different backgrounds and different perspectives to study the history, to study the current politics, to at least agree. You know, on some level, there has to be some agreement on goals, right? I don't know anybody who's not in favor of peace. Can we start with that? And another good example, which is also very divisive on many campuses, is abortion. You know, I often hear complaints. These are the two issues, I think, where I hear about the most polarization. And I think it is absolutely critical to engage with ideas and with information. And I hope that you don't literally feel unsafe, that you're subject to some kind of physical attack or threat of attack. In terms of being ignored and not having a platform, you should have exactly the same opportunities that any other individual or any other student group would have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matthew Morrow. Thank you, Chancellor Martin and Professor Strossen, for holding this discussion. It seems to me that there's two ways to justify the things that you've been talking about, freedom of expression, individual rights in general. One is grounded in a narrative or a metaphysic that claims natural rights to be true and therefore is a truth in a sense. Another way is to use a utilitarian argument that its freedom of expression is just a social good, so therefore we should support it. I'm curious about what your stance, how you're justifying this, which one you're taking, and how do you, if you take the utilitarian argument, if it's not necessarily a truth that is a fundamental truth, then how do you square that with this emerging identity politics that claims that the best way to view people are members of groups? And so I don't view you as an individual with unique characteristics and free choice, but I view you as a white woman who is in a position of privilege and class and is speaking from a point of power and asserting something else rather than individual thoughts and ideas.
Oh, wow. I can't do justice to that in the short time I have available. So let me just start by saying to the first part of your, it's an excellent question, Matthew. To the first part of your question, I would say both, and I go back to one of the great dissenting paeans to free speech that in the early 20th century from Louis Brandeis that has been adopted by the Supreme Court unanimously in 1969. And he said, our founders valued liberty both as an end and as a means. And I think that tradition has carried through correctly in Supreme Court jurisprudence, where the justices have said, self-expression, even if you are not communicating anything to anybody else, let alone participating in the democratic process, is independently valuable. But also it is essential in a democratic republic where we, the people, are the governors. We must have sufficiently robust freedom of speech to be able to strongly critique and dissent from those who govern us. As to the second part of your question, I'm sorry, I'd be happy to try to talk to you about that personally, but individually, but I'd like to get to the others behind you in line.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming to Washington University. I'm an alum of the undergraduate and law school over 50 years ago, so I'm not a student, though I've tried to be through my life. I was wondering, in the last 48 hours, the news media has exposed a group of very conservative individuals who plan to go after individual reporters and organizations that are against the Trump administration and essentially weaponizing personal aspects, family personal aspects, going after members of the family and everything as both retribution and as an inhibition of their rights to speech, to free speech, as well as their carrying out their professional obligation as reporters, journalists, and opinion writers. I was wondering what thoughts you had in that as an aspect of that, and secondarily, given the deliberate weaponization of these types of attacks, whether our current libel laws would effectively cover that or should be modified by judicial opinions, basically, to include them.
Excellent summary of an extremely troubling situation where the government is using threats, as you say, to expose not only journalists but also their family members to harassment and potential retaliation, including loss of jobs. And by the way, it's already happened, right? As I read, at least one incident, I think at least 2 journalists have already lost their jobs because they were embarrassed by things that they said, which were ill-advised but had subsequently been retracted and were long ago. Now, the difficulty is, as your question suggests, that this is an exercise of free speech, right? Disclosing information, and by the way, it's truthful information. So defamation would not be available at all. For a statement to be liable as defamation, it has to be false as well as injuring your reputation, but we are entitled to, and you know, to judge fairly and neutrally as much as possible. Think if the shoe were on the other foot. Suppose somebody were doing these investigations about, let's say, Fox or Breitbart reporters about nasty things they had said and trying to bring pressure on them to repudiate those views. It's a very, very difficult issue because we understand that the exercise of free speech can, in some cases, have paradoxically a suppressive view, a suppressive impact on free speech. The best source that I can suggest is PEN America, which is a writers and journalists free speech organization. They issued a press statement about this, and they've also issued a report on how we should direct our counter speech specifically to attack those who are engaging in this kind of trolling and doxing and harassing of those who are trying to provide information to the rest of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very complicated, interesting issue. Hi.
Hello, I'm Fidel Alkalani.
Hi.
I'm a sophomore. So I had a question about deplatforming, but the first question and answer made me want to address another point, as I am a Muslim Palestinian on campus as well. You said that there is no necessarily imminent fear of physical harm, but there is another reason why a lot of people do not speak out against Israel, and that is the fact that, for instance, I have visited family in the Palestinian territories before. If I were to speak out, say, in favor of BTS, and any kind of evidence of that were to reach the Israeli government, I could be arrested upon entry. That is of physical fear, given that a lot of Palestinians who are arrested by the Israeli government get beaten, as has happened to several of my family members, get beaten, and a lot of human rights violations occur in those prisons. So while it is not an imminent danger, it is a very real one that could occur in the reasonable future. And I would like to hear what your thoughts are on that and how that pertains to free speech protection.
Well, I would say it is actually an imminent danger. The question would be, when the government would have the opportunity to actually imprison you. But you're saying the minute that you express those ideas, you are putting yourself in imminent danger, and that's terrible.
All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is Samantha Marcotte. I am a first-year student here. In your book, you stated that hate speech should be protected until that hate speech leads to violence. So if a political figure or anyone in power were to post on social media about a minority group in a negative connotation, using words such as invasion, criminals, rapists, etc., and someone was to take and use those words as motivation to commit a violent crime against members of said minority, I'm curious if that hate speech would still be protected under the First Amendment, and would that political figure or person in power be considered responsible for that hate speech being turned into violence?
Sadly, we have that kind of rhetoric absolutely rampant, right? In the political sphere, the public sphere, journalists, and while we have absolutely too much actual violence, the fact remains that the vast majority of us who hear that rhetoric do not, therefore, engage in violent actions. In fact, most of us are repulsed by it and are inspired to engage in completely different actions, volunteering to be welcoming to refugees and to immigrants. So again, if we loosen up the standard, and I understand the intuitive appeal of it, to say, well, it might lead somebody to engage in violence. I have absolutely no doubt about it. Throughout history, all kinds of expression has been credibly blamed by people who have committed horrendous acts of even mass atrocities. What is the book that has been blamed more than anything else, or the expressive work that's been blamed more than anything else for making me do it? The Bible. The Quran, some people blame for instigating violent acts. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment has been cited by people who went out and committed copycat crimes. There's a famous case in the Supreme Court, will be familiar to Andrew, that involved an old movie called Mississippi Burning. That was a documentary about the civil rights movement, and it depicted the horrific violence and torture, racial oppression, and a group of young African-American men and boys had watched the movie, and they were discussing a really horrific scene based on reality of white racists beating up a black boy while he was praying. And these kids in Wisconsin said, who were watching the movie, do you feel all hyped up to move on some white people? They were definitely instigated and enraged in ways we can understand by having seen that film. And they went out and assaulted a white boy and pummeled him into unconsciousness. It went to the Supreme Court on another issue. But the point is, are we then going to punish the movie, Mississippi Burning? And so over and over, we have to separate a message that might have that possibility, because if we had that standard, there would be no free speech left. And we have to demand a more tight and direct causal connection. I can use, the president himself has come quite close to satisfying the appropriately strict intentional incitement of imminent violence standard. This actually went at least to a trial court, may have even gone to an appellate court, at some of his campaign rallies. One in particular went the furthest in a lawsuit. There were some demonstrators, anti-Trump demonstrators, and he said to his supporters, get them out of here. And then he made some other statements like, in the old days, they used to carry them out on stretchers. And then he said, you know, I'll pay your lawyer's fees. And that was close enough that a reasonable fact finder could say, well, maybe that does constitute intentional incitement of imminent violence. It was a judge who was the fact finder, not a jury. And the judge said, well, Trump also said, don't hurt them. And the judge decided that on balance, that meant his speech was protected. But you understand how that came so much, because the Trump supporters did beat up the protesters, did assault them. So that's the difference between attacking people in general with horrible rhetoric and instigating violence against particular individuals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being with us. And Nadine, thank you so much
Great
for being here
questions.
at Washington University. I'd like to invite my colleague, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Dr. Lori White, to give some closing remarks.
Thank you. How about a round of applause? We purposely select today, the first day of classes, to have this event each year as an opportunity, I think, for us to set the tone for the rest of the year and really appreciate your reflections, Nadine, on your book, appreciate the wonderful questions, thoughtful, intellectual questions that were asked. This is exactly what a university community is all about. And so my role in the program at this point, as we close, is to send us forth with a charge that I would like for all of us to think about as we move throughout this academic year. In assigning Professor Strossen's book, our goal, contrary to the belief of some who question the selection, was not to endorse hate speech on campus, but to engage in a conversation like we did this evening about what does freedom of expression, one of our most fundamental constitutional rights, mean in both historical and today's context. So as we go forth this afternoon, let me leave you with 3 charges. Charge number 1, and Nadine, I didn't know what your remarks were going to be, but my charges align with what you have said. So charge number 1 is let us commit ourselves to be allies to those communities with whom we do not share an identity, and as allies be the voice for others who are the targets of hateful speech and actions. When hate speech occurs, such speech is most often directed toward those who have been historically marginalized. And in fact, too many instances of individuals and communities who are marginalized bear the burden of calling out injustice. We must speak up and speak out when we see injustice on our campus and in our communities. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Through today's reflection event, I hope we have learned why it is so important that we allow for the rich diversity of voices and opinions to manifest themselves as part of our democracy. Think about how so many throughout history tried to silence the voices of dissent. As messy as democracy can sometimes be, we can be a stronger university, a stronger community, a stronger nation when dissenting opinions are not suppressed. How can we expect to change that we do not like or that with which we do not agree if we are unwilling to hear the other side? As James Baldwin once said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So charge number 2 is resolve to face those things that we believe we must change, and to face them through the various means that we have available to us: activism, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of the press, and civic and community organizing and engagement. As members of this incredible and imperfect university, we have an obligation to use our privilege and platform to affect change. And finally, acknowledging that 2019 marks 400 years since the first slaves of African descent were brought to this country. If a people so battered and bruised could hold on to the belief that one day a change gonna come, surely so can we. So charge number 3, in what feels like difficult times in our country and in our world, believe in the words of Sam Cooke. Wish I could play them, so you have to listen to the song. Change is gonna come. So says Sam Cooke, there have been times I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know change is gonna come. Yes, it will. So as we take our leave of one another this evening, let's offer each other some gesture of fellowship and solidarity with one another, such as a handshake, maybe a hug, maybe a few simple words of uplift. I thank you for attending today's program. Be sure to join us for the reception in the Crowder Courtyard in the Law School. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the program as listed in your program, and also thank those who ushered tonight's program, the first-year execs from the South 40 Council. Thank you again, and please join us for the reception.